Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
With 15 million kids in childcare every week, this industry has a $99.3 billion economic impact, and it is responsible for more than 2 million jobs overall. Childcare is undoubtedly a major component of American life, but what about from a business perspective? Are we providing adequate childcare? And do enough people have access to affordable care? A recent report from the Committee for Economic Development contains the answers. If the numbers I shared initially don't convince you that you should be concerned about childcare, then consider this. These kids are going to be responsible for your retirement, and they will inevitably become a significant voting bloc. Childcare and the quality of it impacts all of us. Today, we get to speak with one of the people responsible for the report from CED and someone who is renowned as one of the foremost thought leaders in her field. Cindy Cisneros is the Vice President of Education Programs at the Committee for Economic Development, CED. She most recently served as Director of Member Practice at Public Education Network, or PEN. Cindy also worked at the U.S. Department of Education. She received her BA in Political Science and Economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and holds an MPA from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Cindy has also made numerous appearances on The State of Us. Cindy, thanks for joining us again today.
Justin, it's an absolute delight to be with you again. Thank you.
We're really looking forward to the conversation. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on childcare and the economy without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Good afternoon, folks. Cindy, it's always good to talk to you, and Justin, of course, education. I'm very excited about this topic, and I've talked about it many times with other people, but never with someone with Cindy's background or with the information she has. So I'm interested to see where this all goes.
So let's get into it, Cindy. When people think of childcare, the first thing that comes to mind for most is probably not its educational value or its sizable economic impact. So how are families in the U.S. making use of childcare?
So families really are making use of paid childcare, a lot more than you might think. The most surprising finding, just to go back to your opening about the amount of revenue that this industry generates, that was the most surprising finding from the CED study, was that total amount that the industry generates. And not only that, it also helps employ 2 million people in this country. So in terms of usage, more than half of families utilize childcare services in this country. About 60% of kids under 5 are in paid childcare every week, and that adds up to about 15 million kids. And as we discovered in our study, the use is highest in 2-parent families with both parents working full-time, and it's used by single parents who are working under 35 hours a week. And we also noted there was an interesting correlation between educational level in families, and particularly for mothers. So the more educated the mother, the more they make use of childcare. So 2/3 of women with a BA use childcare compared to only about half with a high school degree.
What do you think causes that? Is that a correlation of they maybe have a job that is more demanding of their time, or just that they understand the value of childcare better?
I think it's both. For those families who choose to want to have both parents in the workplace, they understand that that does provide them an opportunity to participate in the workforce. And if they have the means to do that, they choose it. And they also understand that early learning in this current day is a lot different than it used to be in terms of what it actually delivers in supporting children's health, development, and well-being. Those are the most critical years for children between birth and the age of 5. So what happens in a childcare setting is really important, and it has the ability to impact that child's trajectory in life. And so research has found that investing in early childcare and having parents choose childcare really does help prepare their children to start school and succeed in life.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I think the cost can be prohibitive, but the fact that the education is very strong. The number of kids in childcare from the report is above average in the suburbs, but below average in small towns and rural areas. What impact, Cindy, does this have on the economy, but also on the development of the country as a whole?
Yeah, it's a good question. We were curious to see what we would discover taking a look across the country in all states. And there are definite regional variations across the country that we found. And you are correct in that the number of kids in childcare is generally higher in suburbs, but actually the biggest factor impacting that variation is the labor force participation rate for women. So it's interesting. So the rate that women are participating in the labor force has steadily increased. So mothers with kids under 6 between the years of 2005 and 2017 has steadily increased. So that means there are more women choosing to acquire childcare service for their kids. And we also noticed that the share of children in regular childcare is about 50% across all income ranges, up to about $60,000. But once you look at families who have higher income households, then usage definitely increases for those particular households. We did discover, and I thought this was really interesting, that the usage of paid childcare is highest in the Upper Plains, New England, and the Mid-Atlantic regions, and the lowest rates of paid childcare includes Oklahoma, West Virginia, Hawaii, New Mexico, and Arizona. And again, there is a lot of variation given the type and level of industry in each of the states across the country, density of population, average state income, and the actual infrastructure for childcare.
Are there enough childcare centers available? I mean, is there anywhere in the study where you found out that parents wanted to participate in a system and there weren't spots open or enough businesses open to provide the spots for all the people who wanted it?
Yes, absolutely. And you might have heard people refer to those as childcare deserts. So there are some states, depending upon, again, the population and concentration of that population, there may not be sufficient infrastructure to attract both industry and families willing to move there, and therefore ultimately childcare gets established. In 2016, there were more than 675,000 market-based providers in this country.
Market-based providers. Can you define that real quick for listeners?
Absolutely. Those are businesses that are charging for some type of paid childcare. And we also included in the study family-based childcare providers, again, who are charging for their services.
So you've got these rural areas and they struggle, with a lot of different things. There's challenges to living in these places. Healthcare is a big one that we've talked about. Childcare maybe is not one of those things that necessarily comes to the forefront of people's minds. But is there anything that CED proposes that these areas could do to improve access to it?
Yes. And we talk a lot in our education work, and particularly in our work supporting early childhood education and access and quality, in terms of a public-private partnership approach. So that you really have to think about problem solving in states in terms of who are all the stakeholders involved, and that you can bring to the table to actually create solutions, create incentives, help create that infrastructure that's needed. Employers, governors are going to want to have a healthy economy in their states. How can they attract business? How can they retain business and employers? And knowing that employees and families really do need to have childcare access available to them in order to participate in the workforce. So bringing different stakeholders together, like business leaders and others, to figure out how can we address this particular challenge and meet the needs for both businesses and families.
We're talking with Cindy Cisneros, the Vice President of Education Programs at the Committee for Economic Development, and she contributed, of course, to this report, The Business Case for Investing in High Quality Childcare. We've only started on the basics, and we're going to look at development and the path forward. What could be done to improve healthcare? There's lots more to talk about, but before we do, Lance, it's important that we take a moment and remind our listeners why we're having this conversation in the first place. Childcare is not one of those things that necessarily gets all that fancy mainstream media attention, but nevertheless, it's one that is nearly $100 billion a year that it contributes to this economy, either directly or indirectly. That's a lot of money. So why are we having this conversation
because
today?
Here at True Chat, we have a mission, and that mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
We might be a little biased, huh? Because the education component mission leads right off with that. But hopefully we're getting that done. And let us know. thestateofus.org will also link to CED's website and the report as well. So if anybody wants to dive deep into the details and the hard work that the team here has put in, they can definitely take a look at it. Again, we're going to talk more about childcare coming up, development, and the path forward. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
With 15 million kids in childcare every week and an industry that's responsible for more than 2 million jobs overall, it is almost inconceivable to think that anybody could contend that childcare is not an important part of our nation's economy. And more than half, Cindy, of the nation's preschoolers are in a regular care engagement from a non-parental source. They're in childcare on some kind of regular basis that isn't provided by their parents. Will these children develop differently than those who were completely taken care of by a parent?
Justin, I think that is a really interesting question. And I just have to say how much I appreciate that the State of Us is taking a look at the issue of childcare, which I think its time has come, not only from the point of view of understanding more about what childcare offers and provides to businesses and families, but it's also risen to such a degree that even current presidential candidates have talked about the importance of childcare and early learning and have developed particular proposals. So getting back to your question in terms of, is there a difference for kids who are in early learning? I would say we would never say that one is better than the other, parents and families versus child care centers or family care homes. It really is a choice for families and how they want to balance work and childcare if they have children. But what we can say is that childcare is definitely a business. It's a structured environment designed to promote learning and development from a professional who's trained with the education and skills to deliver an early learning experience for kids in a safe and healthy setting. And they do have to abide by licensing and regulation. So it's a much more structured environment, but the whole point is really designed to support the learning and development of children by professionals who know how to help facilitate and nurture that.
Do you think that something or a way to improve childcare in this nation could be to increase access to paid parental leave? Because this is an area we actually did an episode on this recently where we talked about only about 16% of private sector employees have access to paid parental leave. And that seems like if that was increased, that would also be something that would help childcare, because we say childcare, and I think most people immediately conjure up the idea, right, of a paid professional in a professional setting. But we could also be referring to parents taking care of their children and providing that developmental nurturing in their lives. So where does that fit in here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of several different kinds of strategies. And again, really trying to help provide families and give them choice in how they want to raise their kids and how they want to start their families. So there are definitely other kinds of, benefits. The research has definitely shown that any type of childcare or early learning is beneficial for all kids, but especially for the most disadvantaged. And so we have been at CED promoting the importance of early learning for over 50 years. We have an extensive history of producing reports and briefs in support, but really there's a number of different ways to figure out how to provide both access and quality. So, choice of parents or in centers, making, sure to try and address the actual cost. That's also part of access, and supply, and making sure we have quality workforce, the early educators in that workforce, for kids as well is going to make a big difference, for them.
As a graduate of President Johnson's, original Head Start program back in the mid 60s, I would second all of that. Coming from a rural place, and it allowed me to get an early start in school and learning and everything else. So when you say 50 years, I guess that's almost, it's been even longer than that since President Johnson took a look at that and tried to help folks out. So like in many areas of the economy and society, access to childcare affects men and women differently. Statistically, what are some of the effects of access to childcare that impact women more than men?
And it's true, the impact is greater on women in the U.S. Mothers here in this country typically bear the brunt of parental childcare responsibilities, yet they are a significant and growing part of our workforce. Across the country, there's actually more than 18 million families with kids under the age of 12, including a mother who works or is looking for work. And last year, roughly 2/3 of women with kids under age 6 were in the nation's labor force. So it's important for both employers and employees to have access to childcare. We need to recognize that by at least one estimate, businesses are losing more than $4.4 billion a year due to absences resulting from breakdowns in childcare arrangements. And most of those absences are from women, are from the mothers of those children. And we also know that 94% of workers involuntarily working part-time, they'd prefer to work full-time, but they're only doing part-time due to childcare problems. And those workers are women.
How much again, Cindy? Say that number again.
94%.
94%. And what's the dollar value in relation to work lost?
So work loss costs businesses $4.4 billion a year.
Okay. Billion with a B.
Yes, with a B. And we also like to add, so there's a loss from an economic business standpoint, and there's also a related loss for parents in their own household income. It is estimated between $35 billion is lost because the high cost of childcare leads a lot of parents to leave the workforce or reduce their hours so that they can care for children, at home. It's just too expensive. And so that means also if there's a loss of household income, there's also a loss of tax revenue for the government.
So it's a big cycle.
Yes, it is. It's all connected.
You lose the economic value from business. You lose it at home because you're not working as much, and the government loses tax revenue because people aren't making as much, so they're not paying as much in taxes.
Yes,
The
correct.
full circle. So there's definitely, it's no doubt that there's room to improve, right? So let's talk about some of the things that could be improved in childcare. There's a lot of ideas about there, but let's focus on some of the most pressing and some of the most practical. Childcare pricing. This is an area that's been talked about a lot. Should this pricing be based on a need-based system? And what does that look like from a legal perspective? In other words, is this handled federally? Is this a state issue? What level of government is involved, or no government at all?
So, and definitely cost in pricing is a huge challenge in figuring out how can childcare be improved. We have definitely made strides in communicating about childcare, that this is not babysitting, that these are critical developmental years when there is brain building going on for kids. That is the most highly developmental period for children. So we also like to refer to the educators who are in these child care centers and settings as brain builders. So there is a lot more understanding about what it is, what it offers to kids, and the traditional role it plays for parents to allow them to participate in the workforce. But this issue of cost is definitely a big one. And it's tough as business owners for them to figure out how to cover the cost of providing quality. That is expensive, and you want to pay your early educators a living wage, which they currently do not make. Just as an aside, and we can do an entire program just on the early educator workforce, but they're only paid about on average $12 an hour with an average annual income of about $22,000. And they themselves find that they have to be on public assistance programs. So there are definitely different components for thinking about how to improve the system, because you want to make sure the curriculum, the quality of the setting is of high quality. You want to make sure the adults in the room, that workforce is a quality workforce that is educated and has the competencies. So in terms of support, we, again, do believe in that public-private approach. So the federal government provides two primary programs of assistance for families. So they're both operated by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so the first is the Child Care and Development Fund, and the second is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families programs. And the Child Care Fund provides actual subsidies to eligible low-income families who need childcare because they're working, they're participating in training, or going back to school. And TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, provides time-limited assistance for families to acquire training leading to a job. And as part of that, it includes coverage for childcare services. And there are a lot of families who benefit from this type of childcare. In fiscal year 2016, 823,000 families with 1.4 million children received this direct childcare assistance.
Just one thing very quickly then, what are some of in your study, are there any other options, or what other options I should say, are important and practical to put in place? You say the government's looked into this. Are there some, we know money always helps, but are there any low cost or easy things we could put into place that would take care of other issues besides the money?
Yes, there are efforts by states who are looking at, for example, how to improve the early learning workforce, the quality of those educators. So that's one strategy to improve the actual quality of the early learning experience for kids. So they're offering tax credits for educators to go back to school and increase their skills and competencies. So it works as basically a refundable tax credit. So isn't necessarily money up front or allocated in a state, budget. So that is one type of strategy to improve childcare. There's also trying to look at and analyze the different funding streams for childcare, both at the federal and state level. There are different streams that go to different agencies, and there is more coordination needed at the state and national level. Because there's a belief that there could be more efficiencies achieved with that funding and how that funding is leveraged.
We've been talking with Cindy Cisneros, the Vice President of Education Programs at the Committee for Economic Development, about the nearly $100 billion economic impact that childcare generates. We've looked at some of the basics to understand where the childcare industry is. We've also focused on development and the path forward, reasoned solutions in the nation's interest, I think is the goal, right? At CED.
Excellent.
So hopefully that's what's being accomplished. And if anybody out there wants to, see this for themselves, the Committee for Economic Development has put together some great infographics. And if our listeners know me well, they know that infographics, charts, and graphs are my favorites. So be sure to check them out. We'll link them at thestateofus.org along with all the other information that's typically available there, articles, books, and more. Lance and I are going to break down the conversation today and talk a little bit more about the path forward. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
15 million kids every week. This industry has a $99.3 billion economic impact. Childcare is responsible for more than 2 million jobs overall. We had the opportunity to talk with Cindy Cisneros, Vice President of Education Programs at the Committee for Economic Development, in the first two segments of today's program. And now Lance and I are going to get into breaking down some of our biggest takeaways and adding some more of our commentary in, since we really try to get through a lot when we have those guests on and get you guys the most information. So we're going to go through a little breakdown session here in this last segment of The State of Us today. But Lance, before we get started on that, I think it's important that we take a moment and remind people why we're talking about something that the mainstream media is maybe not paying as close attention to as it should.
Well, because our mission statement here at True Chat is to try to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. That's why we're talking about this.
That's what we're hoping to do, right? So that's the goal today, is to get through that. And remember, if you want to follow along, thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org, the articles are linked there for you, anything that we reference today. And in this case, this is a report that is publicly available. So we'll have it linked as well in case you want to look at the executive summary and some of the infographics they have that kind of give you all these numbers at a glance that we've been talking about. So be sure to check that out. Lance, let's get started with some of our biggest takeaways. You want to tell listeners what you most either learned today, or the things that struck you as the most important that Cindy mentioned?
Well, I think when you talk about the economic impact of this topic, and is so huge, or at least a lot bigger than I realized it was. And then you start talking about how young people are impacted on whether or not they had pre-K education. I think this is a really big issue for our nation. When we talk about wage inequality or income inequality, are we kind of putting a wedge in there when we don't have universal pre-K education? This seems like an issue where we can have the largest impact with our investment. We're investing in young people, and if we get them started off on the right foot educationally, and have a better education experience, then they become more qualified workers and can earn more money, and maybe we could take care of some of the other issues that we seem to have on the back end of things. I think that's the biggest thing that I took away from here. I've always been a proponent of early childhood education, and I think it's important, but I think it's also generating so much money and it's so expensive that we're maybe pricing it out of the reach of lower middle class and poor families. And those are probably the people who need it, who could benefit from it the most. And I think that we're maybe missing the boat here. And we're talking about how to solve the problems at the back end. And this may be something where we wouldn't have to spend as much money that we spend on the back end. We could spend less money on the front end and end up in a better situation on the back end as well. I don't know. That's what I think. What's your take on that?
Well, Cindy mentioned partway through, and these struck me because they weren't something that I recalled from the report when we looked at it. I mean, I'm sure that they're in there. But I thought a lot of the statistics about how much it costs the economy, how much negative economic impact there is when problems arise, with childcare, that $35 billion annually in household income that is lost.
Right.
As a result of,
parents having to stay home from work or whatever,
right.
Take care of the children yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you think about it, what else could we pay for with that type of money? Right. I mean, not necessarily the government, but how would that change our economic stance every year? What else could that be going toward? And I think Cindy,
how much money, I don't mean to interrupt you, but to follow my thought there, how many children could get early childhood education with that money? Right. I mean, that's just, I don't know. But anyway, go ahead.
Because think too, I mean, right. And this is part of what she explained when I asked about this is it's a full circle problem, because now if households are making less, they also pay less in taxes, right? And now we have less to do things like childcare with. And that's a problem, obviously, because it's a ongoing cycle. It's things like the chain of poverty that we talk about, that you can't let things like this fester or get worse, because they will inevitably make the problem worse if they're not addressed. And so I thought talking some about, we discussed the big flashy $100 billion a year in economic impact, and not to poo-poo that or downplay it, but I think a big part of the story is also what's lost as a result of problems with the health or with the childcare industry.
I agree with that. And then also it's another one of those items, again, where at least currently in our society and our culture, it's impacting women more than it impacts men, because women are in most cases more responsible. I won't say the only ones responsible. In some cases they are, but they are more responsible for childcare than the man is. And so then it stops them from advancing or earning money or those other types of things you think about in the workplace, because they're having to take care of children.
The private sector, remember, less than 20% of private sector employees have access to paid parental leave. That was a big thing that we talked about a couple shows ago. But I think that's one of those that illustrates, yes, it unfairly burdens women in part because of that. And we have an episode with Janice Ellig coming out about this as well. She's an upcoming guest. And a little bit of what we talked about there was this misnomer that the answer is to get employers to provide maternity leave, because if they don't also provide paternity leave, then you're actually in effect, and that's kind of why it's interesting you brought that up on the personal note, you're in effect forcing the woman to be the one to take the time off in order to do it. And that may not be the arrangement they want. Aside from, it's also saying that, men shouldn't have a role in those early days, and they shouldn't have the opportunity to be there. And I don't think any of that, there's a lot of problems with all of that, but that's a big one when you think about childcare, because, I asked her some about the developmental differences of kids. And of course, I think, it would be silly to pretend like there won't be a difference, to say one is better than the other or not. I think that's really tough, because it varies so much based on the parents, but also on what type of childcare facility are they in.
Well, it's kind of the same attitude that we've talked about with healthcare, that it should be universal early childhood development for all, but you should have a choice. It should be there if you want it. And if you personally, for whatever belief system you have, want to raise your own children before they start school, then you should have that option. We shouldn't force everybody, but you should have that choice. And unfortunately, from talking and listening to Cindy, I didn't get the feeling that most people feel like they have a choice. And like I said, that's just where I think we're falling short. And like you said, it is a big economic circle that where we're losing money and not making tax money. And then where else could we take that money and spend it and do some other good things, as well as benefiting our society through our young people. And then you have the fact that when you talk about women, we know that just recently there are more women college graduates than there are men. So they're entering the workforce with better education. And yet is childcare one of those issues that's stopping them from being able to be as successful as they need?
Well, and I think
or as they could be.
The paid parental leave is something we know that as a country in relation to other developed countries, at similar stages in development, other first world countries, we are lagging behind pretty sorely in that regard in the private sector anyway. Obviously, it's a little different in the public sector. But that's why I think that some of what Cindy discussed on how we can and what we can do to hopefully make access to it better and make it more feasible too for private companies. Because I think, a lot of times it isn't just we don't want to do this or we don't think it's important. It's also we don't know how to do this, or how to do it well. Because that's the other thing is it's no good, right? And it can even be worse than not having it at all if they're going to provide some kind of on-site option, but the on-site option's not well thought through, or it's not well funded, or you don't have the right people in charge. I mean, then you get into now you're providing something that's actually hurtful. A
whole different set of issues.
Right.
Of negative issues could arise.
Exactly. So I think I really enjoyed the conversation. I think you did too, Lance, right? I mean,
very much so.
It's always good to get to talk to Cindy. She's got a wealth of knowledge on this, and so does CED. So again, if anybody wants to, you have the opportunity to view a lot of this data. It is available to the public, and we've got it linked at thestateofus.org. Along with, this episode and the other reference material. So they even have, and we didn't really get to spend any time on this, Lance. They have a state by state breakdown. So you can actually click on your state and get an overview of, fast facts about what's happening in your state and how the economic climate surrounding childcare looks. So if
you're listening, that's a piece that you really need to take the time to look at it and how it affects your area more significantly.
Exactly. So if you want to get that more localized information, definitely be sure to check out the page where we've got all the references linked, thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. In addition to articles, we've also got numerous books there. We've got a couple, I think, that Lance and I are pretty excited for coming up as well. So as always, check out thestateofus.org, stay up to date. And in addition, Lance, right, this is a syndicated radio program and it's a podcast. And part of that means that in order to accomplish that mission, we got to bring other people into the fold. And it's always great if you want to listen to it as a podcast. It's released Tuesdays and Thursdays. So you can get the scoop right away. And what are some of the ways that our listeners could invite others to tune in to the program as a podcast, Lance?
Well, you have Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Washington, D.C., I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.